clock's over to 12 o'clock. We're here from 12 to 1 today for this Faxia Lunch and Learn, a bit of a partnership with the OSP, Teo and Dr. BJ Newton, who we're very fortunate to have with us here today. I'd just like to let everyone know my name is Noni Greenwood. I'm a proud Nampa Wai-Wan woman from Western New South Wales. I've got songlines to Wiradjuri and Gamilaroi country. My mother grew up out at Galar Rail on the mission site out there before she was taken away, and she later connected with her family and mob on Wiradjuri country, where I continue to live and thrive and work on. But I'm also very fortunate to have been able to take on a new role within the OSP, but also within the agency as the Director for Aboriginal Culture and Practice with the Office of the Senior Practitioner here in the Department of Communities and Justice. And before we start, I'd like to take some time to acknowledge country and just honour that right that is there for us to recognise the unceded Aboriginal land of the country that we're all meeting on today. All of you are joining us in different areas across the state and maybe elsewhere within a nation as well in New South Wales. And just to recognise that we're all living and working on unceded Aboriginal land, I'd like to personally thank, honour and pay homage to the Parramatta Girl people of the Darug Nation, who are the owners and the First Nations of the people of the area that I'm actually coming to you from today, and have the privilege of joining all of you through this great presentation and the panel discussion that will follow also. I'd also like to take the time to pay my respects to our elders past and present, and I would also like to acknowledge that of those up and coming leaders that we see with our next generation, that's the children of the future in terms of the leadership that needs to happen for the ongoing culture that is the oldest culture of the world that we know. I'm very proud to call that my own. And I'd also like to extend my absolute respect, Yindamara, to our Aboriginal colleagues who are joining us on this session today. Just before we start, I'd also really want to place some care in the discussions that we're having, and just trigger an understanding and give some warning that whilst BJ's presentation is incredibly compelling and there's a lot for us to learn, there is some information that may be quite confronting for some of our Aboriginal colleagues and peers, but also our families and communities as well. And we'd like to recognise that that may be the case, and also offer some cultural safety and care for our mob should they need to. After today's session, our team from the Aboriginal Culture in Practice will be available to provide some support if need be in any further discussions that need to happen in relation to that, but also to know that we recognise that it might be quite confronting. I'd also like to warmly welcome all of you here that have joined us online in the participation of this particular session today. We're excited that from the last point of call that we had over 1,000 people register for this session, which is a fantastic response. And the more that we can share the learnings from this, the greater it will be seen in terms of what the impacts are for practice for Aboriginal children and families overall. In this Faxia Lunch and Learn webinar today, we do have Dr. BJ Newton from the University of New South Wales here to talk to us about restoration and the Aboriginal children that were a part of the out-of-home care cohort in her analysis of the Pathways of Care Longitudinal study. And after this presentation, we'll be joined with a panel discussion from some cracking practitioners out in our districts, but also within the Transforming Aboriginal Outcomes team. We've got Jody Stewart from Teo joining us there. She'll share some time to share her thoughts on the policy and practice implications of the research findings, and what can be learnt from that also. We also have Cassie and Alana, two members of the restoration team out at Ingleburn CSC, who will share their experiences towards restoration with families in the district that they're working on. And after the panel, we're hopeful that we'll have some time for some short Q&As if the time does permit. So please ensure you put any questions for our speakers and the panel in the chat, and I'll come to them at the end of the session. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. BJ Newton. BJ is a proud Wiradjuri woman and a Centre Senior Research Fellow at the Social Policy Research Centre for University of New South Wales in Sydney. We're so fortunate to have you here with us, BJ. I'm very excited about what you've got to share and the learnings that can actually eventuate from that. BJ's research focuses on working in partnership with Aboriginal communities, organisations and individuals to build evidence and support Aboriginal families interfacing with the child protection system of New South Wales in particular. Her current research, Bringing Them Home, Keeping Them Home, is the first of its kind to investigate the rates, the outcomes and the overall experiences of successful and sustainable restoration for Aboriginal children in out-of-home care. And thank you so much for joining us. I'll hand it over to you now, BJ, to share what you've got to provide today.
Thank you, Noni. So I can drive. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I would also like to acknowledge country. I'm joining you from beautiful Dharawal country today and pay respects to elders and ancestors. I also acknowledge all the families that have and continue to be impacted by the child protection system. The work that many of us do on this line is for them, and they're the reason we're all here today. So just quickly, I'll be providing an overview of the out-of-home care and restoration statistics in New South Wales, and then talking a little bit about the family's culture findings and recommendations regarding restoration. And then I'll be talking about two particular research studies focusing on restoration for Aboriginal children. So this slide shows the number of children and young people in out-of-home care in New South Wales over the last decade. And you can see that the number of all children in out-of-home care has increased by about 12% over the last 9 years. And for Aboriginal children, that increase is much higher, with about 48% of Aboriginal children living in out-of-home care compared to 9 years ago. And this graph and the next one is publicly available through DCJ, and we can put a link in the chat if that's useful. So this slide shows the number of children and young people who have been restored to their parents in New South Wales. And you'll see that there's been a steep decrease in restoration numbers over the last decade, with restorations for all children falling by 55%, and for Aboriginal children, 40.7%. So what this and the previous slide shows is that we're seeing that more children are coming into care, but they're not exiting care through the restoration pathway. They're either remaining in out-of-home care or they're exiting care through another permanency pathway. So the Family's Culture Review, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with now, found a restoration rate of 17.5% of the 1,318 Aboriginal children taken into care over 2015 to 2016. The review found that restoration was not considered possible in 84% of cases, but argued that the restoration rate could have been much higher if the possibility of restoration was identified in more cases and appropriate casework was directed towards this goal with more families. The review also conducted case files analysis of 200 cases and found that in 35% of those cases, there was no casework provided to parents to assist them in restoration. And the review found a number of barriers to restoration, including unclear restoration processes, unrealistic restoration goals, a lack of appropriate support services, and potential legal barriers to families achieving restoration. So these are the recommendations from the Family's Culture Review specific to restoration. And you will see that they're all focused on changes at the systemic, legislative, and practice levels. So turning to the research now, the Pathways of Care Longitudinal study follows the child development and life experiences of all children who first entered care in New South Wales between May 2010 and October 2011. 2,828 of these children went on to final orders by April 2013. These children and their carers, including their parents if they were restored, were invited to participate in a POCLS survey every year and a half or so, and 5 waves of data collection has been completed so far. So a few years ago now, DCJ invited external researchers to design their own POCLS studies using the POCLS data. And the aim of our POCLS study at UNSW was to investigate the rate of restoration for Aboriginal children in POCLS, the factors that influence restoration for Aboriginal children, the experiences of parents whose Aboriginal children have been restored, and the experiences of Aboriginal children and young people. The POCLS restoration study was informed by two different streams of qualitative and quantitative data using different data sets. The quantitative sample included 1,018 Aboriginal children in the final orders cohort. DCJ administrative data was used to compare the circumstances of Aboriginal children who had been restored to their parents with those who were not restored. For the qualitative sample, we explored data from participants in the POCLS survey cohort up to and including wave 4. And we explored interviews from Aboriginal children and their caseworkers and parents whose Aboriginal children had been restored who participated in at least one interview for the POCLS survey. And all up, this was 29 parents of about 39 children. So the research indicated that once on final orders, restoring Aboriginal children to their parents is highly unlikely. The rate of restoration for Aboriginal children in the POCLS final orders cohort is 15.2%, or 155 children of the 1,018 that were removed. And the average time in care for children who had been restored was nearly 2.5 years. So these are not unexpected findings, but they are important given that they demonstrate a disconnect between policy and practice, given that restoration is the priority permanency pathway and outcome for children. There we go. So to compound the significance of the low restoration rate is the finding that most Aboriginal children entering out of home care, regardless of their care outcome, had a very small number of substantiated risk of significant harm reports prior to removal, with about 40% of these children being the subject to just one or no substantiated report. So with these statistics in mind, let's turn to the qualitative data and what Aboriginal parents, children and their caseworkers said. So the POCLS study offered a rare opportunity to learn about what parents say they needed prior to removal and to better support them in the restoration process. Parents reported that they would have liked more engagement and support from child protection services prior to their children being removed, so that they were aware that their children were at risk of being removed. Many parents said they had no prior contact with DCJ or that they were unaware their situation was so serious that removal was a risk, which is backed up by the quantitative data just presented. So one parent said, "I was not able to attend court as I had 3 children at home with no babysitter. At the time, I did not realise the situation was that serious. I felt if it had been better verbalised to me and suggested that I needed legal representation, the outcome may have been quite different." So during removals, parents described caseworkers and police officers as having a lack of respect and compassion for parents and indeed the children in this deeply painful experience. Many parents describe child protection caseworkers as being sneaky and at the time of removal, where they would separate parents from children and distract parents while their child was taken. And a warning, these quotes are upsetting. One parent said, "They were very sneaky how they did it. We were at the doc's office and they took me into a separate room and told me they were taking the children. The caseworker just threw the paperwork in front of me and just said they were taking them. I could hear my children distressed in the other room and I wasn't allowed to see them. I was so distressed." Another parent said, "They should not have had 2 policemen walk into the labour ward at the hospital and remove my child while I wasn't even in the room. They were sneaky about it and lied to me. I was taken to a room halfway down the hall and I couldn't even walk properly. I had just had an emergency cesarean. I went into a function type room in the hospital. They sat me down and they took a long time to tell me that they had actually taken my child." Caseworkers talked about their frustration regarding the restoration limitations in their roles to adequately support families towards restoration. So one caseworker said, "Restoration is being spoken about, but casework intervention towards this process has been minimal due to staff levels and staff unavailability." And another caseworker who worked hard to engage a family for a year, and then the case was transferred to another caseworker, said the new caseworker failed to follow through and explore restoration. Several caseworkers also reported that the case was or had been unallocated to a worker and no contact plan was in place or being implemented. And others commented that the long distances parents have to travel to attend contact with their children makes it difficult for them to attend at all or to do so consistently. But the research has also demonstrated the importance for caseworkers to identify placements and carers that will support restoration, and the need for caseworkers to have the capacity to support placement changes that increase the likelihood of restoration. And I'll highlight with a couple of examples. In one case, a child was placed with non-Aboriginal foster carers. Both parents had unsupervised contact with their child over weekends, where they also saw extended family. The parents had plans in place to apply for a Section 90. In the meantime, the carers moved the child 5 hours away off her traditional country without discussing their plans with their caseworker or the child's parents. Here, the foster carer's decision to move 5 hours away did not support the child's transition to restoration, which required more contact visits with the family. The caseworker further indicated that kin assessments have been identified, every case plan and nil work has been completed because staff have not been supported to do the assessment. In another case, a child was placed in kinship care with their paternal family. The caseworker reported that the kinship carer allowed unsupervised contact with the child's father, who was violent towards the child's mother. The caseworker believed the mother was being bullied by paternal family and carer prior to contact occurring, and so had only attended half of the planned contacts. So this example again highlights the importance of effective casework in promoting the rights and interests of children in out-of-home care, and the role of the caseworker in supporting or not relationships between parents and their children. And this can clearly have an impact on the chances of restoration. So just to reinforce this point, both parents and children highlighted the importance of maintaining family relationships while in out-of-home care, as you can see from what children have said they want. Many children wanted their parents to continue to be involved in their lives and preferably living with them, and wanted their relationship with their parents to be supported and encouraged in out-of-home care placements. In the restoration process, parents wanted more support in the transition to restoration and in the early stages of restoration, so they could better practically and psychologically prepare for their children's return. They also wanted longer or more frequent unsupervised contact visits, particularly in the family home. So for example, one parent said, more contact would have been better, before restoration would have been better. The children came to the family home for supervised visits and they were not allowed to leave the room we were in. They wanted to go to their bedrooms and outside to see the animals, but we all had to stay together. So parents were asked what would have been helpful for them following their child's restoration and what support they would have liked but did not receive. Some parents admitted to feeling lost when their children returned home because they were provided little information or insights into their child's life while they're in care. And you can see that by these quotes at the bottom here. Some parents would have liked more support and advice on raising their child, about their child's behaviour, and more contact with their caseworker. Parents would have also liked additional financial support while they adjusted to providing for their child and access parenting payments. And this would have helped them to address their child's immediate material needs. So I'll now turn to our current research, Bring Them Home, Keep Them Home. This is a 4-year project funded by the Australian Research Council, and we're just over a year in. I also want to acknowledge my fantastic colleagues who are also on this research. From UTS is Paul Gray, and from UNSW is Kylie Cripps, Kathleen Falster, Alana Katz, and Nika Tong. So for this research, we want to understand the experiences of Aboriginal parents who, against the odds, have achieved restoration of their children. How did they navigate the system? What supported them? And what were their challenges? We want to better understand institutional barriers for families and practitioners, and we also want to learn about restoration practices across the state. We also have a significant quantitative component to better understand the size of the problem. Our approach to conducting the research is that it is Aboriginal controlled and led. Most of the researchers on the team are Aboriginal, and we have partnered with 4 fantastic Aboriginal organisations who we work very closely with every step of the way. And just wanting to shout out to our partner organisations and acknowledge their incredible commitment and support for the research. We've partnered with ABSEC, Illawarra Aboriginal Corporation, Waminda and South Coast Aboriginal Medical Services. And we're also guided by an Aboriginal advisory panel, which Jody Stewart, who you'll hear from soon, is on. So one main component of the research is our place-based regional site in the Illawarra Shoalhaven. Here we're working with our partner organisations, NGOs and DCJ to understand restoration pathways in that region. We're doing this by hosting a series of community forums and conducting interviews with Aboriginal parents who have had their children restored or are working towards restoration, family members, practitioners and other relevant stakeholders. Then we're zooming out to understand what restoration looks like across the state in different geographical regions and contexts, because we know it's not one size fits all. And we're doing this by holding a series of online practitioner forums from early next year. So a little bit of a plug, if anybody is interested in joining a practitioner forum in your region, please get in touch with me. So for my last few minutes, I'm going to share some of the findings from our first community forum, which was held in late March this year. And this will contextualise and help us to think about how to apply the findings from the POCLS study. So the community forum was led by our Aboriginal partner organisations and was attended by more than 50 practitioners and stakeholders in the child and family service sector in the Illawarra Shoalhaven. One of the activities we did was look at the current pathways to restoration, what the challenges were and how the pathways could be improved. Some of the factors that created challenges for Aboriginal families in their path to restoration included that decisions about Aboriginal families were often made by non-Aboriginal people and without any input from the family or the agencies that work with the family. That parents are expected to understand the workings of the restoration process and legal system, and they're often not supported to build this knowledge. Because at the same time, services often do not have the internal legal resources or capability to support parents in these processes. There's also inconsistent knowledge and practice amongst service providers working in DCJ, non-government and Aboriginal organisations within the sector about restoration approaches and processes, which creates confusion and limits a holistic approach to working with families and supporting them. So none of this may be surprising to people on this call, but it is important to talk about these challenges and voice that there is a consensus around these issues. The participants also suggested that there needs to be greater alignment between preservation and restoration service models. So if more resources and opportunities were provided to preservation services to conduct restoration work, it will help alleviate capacity issues within the sector, and that a greater collaboration between the two service types will help improve restoration practices and help address inconsistency in practices. This would also enable greater use of trauma-informed practices and a recognition that lapses in behaviour and judgment are accepted as a part of a parent's restoration journey. Family finding and identifying kinship structures must be conducted as early as possible to ensure that a child's connection to family, community and culture is safeguarded post-removal. This was a key point in the forum, and what we are finding in our interviews with families is that when children are old enough, they are making their own decisions to come home to their parents and family. And this is really a key point to a family preservation model, because regardless of government intervention, parents and their children and children and their families have strong bonds and are drawn together. But if that child has not been supported throughout their childhood to have a consistent and quality contact with their family, it will be more challenging for that child to find their identity and that sense of belonging within their family when they do come home. And restoration timelines and practices, which are often seen as strict and bureaucratic-led, would offer greater flexibility under the family-led nature of preservation. So I'm sure it's no surprise that goals, plans and timeframes for restoration need to be flexible and consider the range of competing and contextual issues that arise throughout the restoration process. Parents also need time to process the grief, loss and shame associated with having a child removed. And consideration needs to be given for the sector and system barriers beyond parents' control. For example, turnover of staff and the time it takes to build relationships with new caseworkers or agencies, which we saw from the caseworker POCLS quotes earlier. This is actually an issue. And finally, participants commented that restoration outcomes are shaped by relationships and quality of caseworkers. Caseworkers need the skills to have difficult conversations with carers, to advocate for the needs of the child and their birth family, to support children to have continued and consistent relationships with their parents. And this again was highlighted through the examples provided in the POCLS data. And finally, positive outcomes are more likely when parents are dealing with a caseworker that is proactive, has relationships with services, and genuinely wants to work with the family. So that's it from me. Thank you all for listening, and I'll hand back to Noni.
Hi, thanks, BJ. And a great and informative presentation that really unpacks some of the understandings that many of us would actually have in relation to how the system is or isn't working, particularly in the space of restoration. I think you've done a wonderful job in honouring and sharing the stories of the children and young people that were part of this study, but also those of the families, parents, community, but also the caseworkers and workers that have been working in this space that can be quite troublesome and difficult depending on the influences and the impacts on practice that we've seen. And it is quite confronting to see what we have had in practice with work that needs to be done in our assessment space, and how we move about that substantiation of risk of harm to then moving into case planning for effective change, and being really conscious about our own bias but awareness of what needs to happen in terms of supporting parents through behavioural change that needs to have some support to allow them to actually achieve greater outcomes for them to actually have children stay safely with them. The other thing that I think is quite compelling and for us to think about, particularly with practice in relation to removal or assumption practices for children, is the overuse and over-surveillance of police and authority power when we're actually in that space, and looking at how we can actually utilise our skill set and ability in relational-based practice that can allow us, whilst we may assess the situation to be quite unsafe for a child, be respectful about the process in ways that we actually enact what legislative component needs to be put in place to effectively establish safety. And I do know that there's some work that is being done to concentrate and support on those particular families' culture recommendations of 60 and 61, and what that could look like in terms of the influence and impact on practice. I think the other thing that is quite compelling for me when I'm thinking about where I would like to see a stronger emphasis and support in relation to restoration is unpacking what could work well in that space of restoration practice and where we may have got it wrong. And the thing that is quite startling, I guess, is that this data is some years old. We're almost talking about a decade in that sense, to then looking at what you've got going on in that space of keep them home preservation research and assessment, and analysing what needs to happen in that space of practice that is current and topical and now. And I think that's where we've got a huge benefit in what could be our learning in that space, but would also come through from some of the conversations that we're going to move into with the panel that could actually have some greater influence over what practice looks like and is felt and experienced. But I really wanted to take the time to thank you, BJ, for your commitment and the continued drive that you have in trying to help us understand this, but also understand it from the family and community's perspectives, and really honour the story and experiences of the children and young people within this process. It is quite invaluable for us to actually hear their voices through this process, to be elevated and to have an impact and influence over what practice could look like in the future for the next generations, which could essentially be their mob that we could turn around this for. For any of those on the line, if you've got questions for BJ and you're curious to know more, and believe me, she's a person to connect with to understand this a little bit better. The knowledge and expertise that there is invaluable for influencing what things could look like in and within your practice. Please place them in the chat and we'll move through them if we have time later. But I'd also like to introduce the next session or next component of our session, which is the panel discussion. And I'd like to take the time now to introduce our panel members. Very excited about this. We've got some direct line practitioners that are able to give us some insights. And firstly, as I said earlier, and BJ did mention Jody because of her involvement through the work that they're doing in partnership with the reference group that is supporting the research. We've got Jody Stewart from the Aboriginal Transforming Aboriginals Outcomes team. Jody's a proud Wiradjuri woman from her father's side. She has worked for NGOs in the out-of-home care sector for 12 years and has been with DCJ for the last 6 years. She has experience in residential care, foster care, child protection, and has previously been in the role of a permanency coordinator, which had been quite instrumental in the area that she was working in. She's now working, as I said earlier, with the Transforming Aboriginal Outcomes team as a project lead for the Aboriginal Case Management Policy implementation, which is very exciting to see that we've got some movement actually happening in that space since the development of that policy. And she's a very proud, beautiful mother of a 6-year-old boy. So I'm happy to share that with you as well. And the other two members of our panel today, which are incredibly fortunate to join us as well, and very, very excited to hear some of their news that they may be able to share with us around the innovative kind of work that's happening, but important work that could actually have an influence over what practice looks like for those of you in direct line practice with families and children. We've got Cassandra Pugh, so if you want to give a wave so we know who's who on the screen. Cassie has been working as a caseworker for about 11 years. She started out in disability non-government agency and has been with DCJ for the past 4 years. She was working with the Joint Child Protection Response Program, JCPR. We're all aware of that acronym. There's many of them across the agency. And she's moved into Ingleburn CSC this year and started in the restoration casework team about 6 months ago. And we've got Alana. Ravulo has been working for DCJ for 8 years as a caseworker. We've spent time in both response and assessment teams within the CSCs that she's been in and in the space of preservation with families. She's now currently a part of a pilot restoration program at Ingleburn CSC since September 2021, in which she was the initial caseworker, has been in role as the MCW supporting this work. For those of you who may have been fortunate enough to go to the practice conference, this team and their had actually been recognised for their innovative practice through an award that was given. So I just want to acknowledge that. It's exciting to hear that we've got new initiatives working in the districts, and there may be some learning from everybody on the line today to actually implement into practice. In saying that, Cassie and Alana are very passionate about working with parents to break the intergenerational cycle of DCJ's involvement in their lives and their families' lives, so that children go home and they stay home. So it sits beautifully in alignment with the new part of research that Dr. Newton or BJ is working on at this point in time. But firstly, if I can call to my deadly sister over in Teo, our Senior Program Officer and Project Management of Aboriginal Case Management Policy, Jody, to answer some questions that we've kind of pre-prepared, and I hope we're keen for this yarn, okay?
Hey, Noni, how are you?
I'm good. Good to see you.
Yes,
And I'll start off with the first question, and what we're keen to know about is tell us a little bit about yourself and your role in DCJ.
Yes, so I'm currently, as you said, working in Teo, and I'm loving this role there. I've become project manager of the implementation of the Aboriginal Case Management Policy within the last couple of months. Teo is committed fully to implementing the policy. We do acknowledge that it has sort of been out in the world of practice for a couple of years, but we are committed to rolling it out across the state now in line with the FIT legislation to bring the changes to practice that are needed. We have been working in Hunter Central Coast District as the first area, supporting those guys in implementing it within their district. We still are working with those guys. You know, we've done a lot of work around, you know, what would practice look like, how does it align, and, you know, any sort of hiccups that we have come across. So we've designed a blueprint that we will then work across all the other districts. So in the new year, we plan to, you know, align with district leaders and get the mind of them thinking and supporting them in what the ACMP will look like within their districts and how we can implement it. We'll be there to support all the districts. We also sort of had a little launch, I guess you could say, of the case management policy at the ABSEC forum a couple of weeks ago with the NGO sector and the ACOs. So, you know, it's all coming about now. So get your roller skates on, I'd say, for the next year, because we want to get it out there. We do also acknowledge that it's not going to be fully implemented, but it's the starting process, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, really exciting news, and good to see that we've got some momentum that's happening in that space. It's been long overdue. What we know about the principles of the Aboriginal case management policy is it aligns quite strongly with it is about the notion of family-led decision making and having them involved within that, but also the importance of relational-based practice and actually having strong relationships that are effective for change, that create opportunities for support and care for families and allow for us to actually see families stay together with safety achieved for children. So I think, you know, and the network of family wrapped around that. So that's great.
Yeah.
Just curious to know, what did you think about, or what was going through your mind when you're hearing the findings from BJ's POCLS study? And what do you think about these findings in terms of what it would mean for Aboriginal families in the space of restoration?
As an Aboriginal person, I found it sad, but I also found that, you know, it concretes into, I think, what a lot of people, especially Aboriginal families and communities, know is that the department's still got a long way to go in how they work with our families. I also want to acknowledge to BJ that the work she does is amazing, and I'm glad to be, you know, a part of that work. And I feel that the time is right with the research that BJ is doing with Teo taking on board and studying the implementation of the Aboriginal case management policy. And I'm pretty sure that everybody sitting in this room, you know, listening to what BJ had to say would agree that, you know, the time is right to change practice. You know, the thing I would like a strong focus on, I think, would be if hearing the number of our families that were going through the restoration process is what was the blockages in making these restorations successful. Like, we, you know, as a department, you know, do we sit here and say it's the family's fault, or do we take ownership that, you know, we actually let a lot of families down? When you listen to what BJ was saying, that families and children were saying in her research work, it makes you question, you know, what were the main reasons that, you know, had the blockage of the restoration. So that's something that, you know, I would love to dig deeper into. I also think that BJ's research brings, and it came to my mind as a strong focus on how we do removals. It seems to be that we're still doing removals that occurred, you know, 60 odd years ago, where, you know, mothers were waving bye to their kids in the back of a car driving away, kids screaming and things like that. And to hear that police were, you know, going into a hospital and a mum's just given birth and taking her baby, it just brings your mind back to those things where our ancestors and our older elders of our community today, you know, they experienced that, and we know the impact it has had on that. So, you know, it was very moving, and very inspirational as well to hear. Even though you hear those things, it gives you the courage and the ability to want to make change. And that's why I'm here. That's why I've come to the department, and that's why I'm in the role that I'm in. So,
Yeah.
and I think for our families, I think it makes it more concrete to them on, their fears are legit. Their trust issues that they have with us in hearing that, the swappage of caseworkers, the way we work with them, the lack of support. And I think it gives little success to them when they come in touch with the department that, we just go, oh, the family gives up. But to me, it's not that the family just thinks they've got no hope. They've already been traumatized once by the removal. How is it that they're going to cope with more trauma by not having the right support, feeling that they're letting their kids down and not getting their kids back home? So, yeah.
Yeah, great, Jody. And I mean, I guess that stuff is the stuff that speaks to our heart and spirituality as Aboriginal practitioners, but also Aboriginal people who are actually having to deal with these, supporting families who are going through it. And that acknowledgement of what that actually means for Aboriginal families, and their probably more innate responsibility of us as DCJ practitioners to lean into that space of partnership with families and really building on that, and owning what responsibility and obligation we have in that space in terms of the work that needs to be done on a practitioner level to support families through the process of change, and making sure that we can actually preserve families to having children return back home. Yeah. And how do you think that might be different for Aboriginal families in particular when you're working with an Aboriginal family? If we were to share some insights to non-Aboriginal practitioners who may be on the line today.
I think if you're, if an Aboriginal family that we were working with sort of had that presentation presented to them, it would bring a lot of discomfort to them, knowing that they're in touch with a department that still has a lot of biased opinion and views, that history is continually repeating itself, but not only repeating itself with Aboriginal people in general, but also families that have already been in touch with the department. We view their history and we sort of have that in mind, and we don't give them half a chance, because we base on what occurred 20 or 10 years ago when that child came into care, and we sort of have that really biased opinion around the family in general. So for a family, it's really hard for me, that would be the biggest challenge when families are working with the department and caseworkers out there today, is that it comes down to that trust, that the discomfort. Have a look at the way the child was removed, and not only that, a caseworker working with the family at the start, and then that caseworker goes in, if they have to do the removal, like that's just letting down hope of a family automatically. So yeah, for families, it's when they hear the word the department, it's not something that they enjoy hearing. And it's hard for, as you would know too, Noni, as an Aboriginal worker, when you're working in the department and your community knows that you're within the department, you don't clock off, you're there to support families after it, but also at the same time you could get a little bit of criticism of why you want to work for a department that has such a, not so wonderful experience with Aboriginal communities. But we're here to make that change, and that's what we're here to do for our communities.
Absolutely, and I heard you say that in your opening, when you were talking about your commitment to and Tayo's commitment to the rollout of actually embedding and operationalising the ACMP, and what that will look like in terms of the impacts that it will have for generations to come for our Aboriginal communities as well. So it's absolutely part of our why. We all have different parts of the why that make it up, but that's definitely part of our why as well.
Yeah.
And I think in that space, it might be good. I know we did have a question about anything else that you want to share with those that are listening today, but I think you've shared some really important pieces of, insights that people can take away and reflect on. Is there anything further that you want to share for those that are joining today?
Yep, I think just don't give up on the family. You've got to remember the trauma and understand the family. They're not stepping away because they don't want their child back. They're stepping away because they've, had trauma re-triggered. So don't give up on them. Family-led decision making, it's a huge part of the Aboriginal case management policy. Empowering families to have the voice. Really listen to the families. They are the experts of their family and their needs. And also the importance of family finding, which, BJ also mentioned in her research, of just how important it is to, acknowledge that Aboriginal families are a little different. So you do have to dig a little bit harder in there to get the family finding right, but just don't give up. That shows a lot to a family too if you're not giving up. They're more likely to really want to work with you to get Bub back, because that's what we all want, is our kids back home, and families will move heaven and earth to make that happen. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jody.
Thanks,
so
Noni.
beautiful and great to hear your thoughts and even just some, good ideas for people to think about, giving that commitment, tenacity and dedication to families, and just to continue to show up and follow through when you do. And I think that's a beautiful kind of segue to where we're going through to have a bit of a yarn. And I wanted to make sure that it's quite informal for these fellas and make sure that we're in this space of really getting a bit of understanding about what's happening in Alana and Cassie's world and the work that they're doing in the restoration space around Ingleburn and the leadership that's over there. So thank you too for joining us here today. Lovely to see your beautiful faces and hear from both of you. A bit of a rookie error for me. I'm not sure who I'm throwing to first, but I've got my first question I need to talk. So Alana, I'm up to you, girl. What systems are you implementing that have been that you feel have been a benefit in your practice and working with families, parents, children towards the process of restoration?
So I guess gaps were identified in the support that one caseworker was able to provide to parents when their child entered care. So the one caseworker needed to share time between supporting the child and ensuring all their needs were met, and supporting the carer to safeguard the placement so that it was stable. So that this meant that limited time was left to provide support to the parents, as this was often a task that fell to the bottom of the caseworker to-do list. So parents were often provided with the summary proposed plan that was filed in court. That's kind of one of the first documents that outlined the tasks that DCJ would like them to complete and expected what to do next. It was kind of like, here's your SOP, off you go. So this led to the development of the restoration caseworker, a separate caseworker to work solely with the parents. So the restoration caseworker meets with the parents at the meeting where the SOP is discussed. The restoration caseworker will then break down the SOP into a family action plan with the family. So this makes it really clear what the worry is, what the goal is, and what tasks are needed in between in order for us to reach the goal of restoration. So there is still a primary caseworker who supports the child in the placement and prepares all the legal work. The restoration caseworker works alongside the primary caseworker by providing monthly reports regarding the parents' progress in the family action plan for change. So parents benefit from the one-on-one support, knowing that we are their caseworker to support them. We have time to build the relationship so that we can really nourish the change. We can understand the parents and what their needs are. We can explain DCJ processes so that they can really understand everything that is happening. We also have been building relationships with local services who understand our role, which ultimately benefits the parents and the families that we are working with.
Perfect, Alana. You know, and it's great to see that the initiative has been put in play to actually invest, you know, twofold for the family, to have two caseworkers who actually are working in partnership with each other and building those relationships with families and carers and the children as well through that process. So that's beautiful to hear. And again, Alana, another question for you at this point in time. Is that correct? Goodo.
Yes.
And from a practice perspective, how do you think restoration for an Aboriginal family may differ from restoration with a non-Aboriginal family?
So we take part in a lot of consultations to ensure that we're providing the best support and including the right services. We have a variety of consultation points where we will bring in the casework specialists, psychologists and Aboriginal consultants and any services that we're working with as well. So we really value working collaboratively. So we'll ensure these recommendations are followed. We are flexible in our approach. There is no expectations for parents to meet us in the office. We love having meetings out in the community, whether it be a home visit, a service, a park. We let the family choose the space and where they're comfortable meeting us. Again, we have more time than the primary caseworker to be able to do this with the parents that we are working with. So we really value the time that we have and building those relationships with the parents. We like to access cultural specific services so that parents can find healing through culture. So we encourage parents to have a support person with them if that's what they want. We are transparent in our conversations and are open about the process. And we encourage questions and open for family to be a part of that too.
Singing from the song sheet of the Aboriginal Case Management Policy there, it sounds very aligned, and I think that's fantastic to hear that, and the idea that the expectation, the responsibility is on us as practitioners, not the family as well. I think that's really lovely and reassuring to hear, and it kind of feels that it aligns a lot with some of the voices that Dr. BJ shared. I always want to talk to the professional because I'm very proud of her as an Aboriginal peer as well, but BJ talking about what she had actually found with what the family's voices were and the practitioners' voices around the challenges and the restrictions that kind of did put in play for practice as well. Okay, Cassie, you're up, girl. Have you made any changes to your practice when working with Aboriginal families? And if so, would you mind sharing with us today what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose Alana has just explained some of those changes that we try to make to our working with Aboriginal families. I was wanting to share a bit of that through an example with a mum I'm currently working with. So I'm currently working with a 20-year-old Aboriginal mum and her partner. So her two little kitties came into care a couple of months ago. We had some worries about mum's mental health, her experience of violence and an unsafe living environment for the kids. So really mindful that mum had her own involvement with DCJ as a child. So just really mindful of her experience and just the trauma that this would be rehashing and bringing up for her. So really important, like Alana spoke to, about the time to really build trust with this mum. So I suppose my first point of call was, drawing on our colleagues from Bindaliri Bala. So that's our Aboriginal consultant team in the Southwest Sydney district. Just at the beginning of work with the family. So I knew mum had quite fractured relationships with her own family, and there wasn't a lot of support around her because of her own experience in care as well. So in the consult, we really spoke about giving choice and control back to mum. And so really mindful for her, she'd voiced up at the beginning, don't ever want to meet in the office. Don't ever bring me there. Don't ever tell me that I have to be there. So it's been really important in our work, like Alana said, meeting out in the community and the service that she's been linked in with. We do a lot of work there. So always offering a support person as well. So at the beginning, when we did our family action plan with mum, walked into the home, Auntie was there, uncle was there, 4 cousins, and it was really empowering, I think, an experience for mum as well, just to see so much support around her. And it was a great way for DCJ to hear from the other knowledge holders in the family, and that there were a lot of people in the community we weren't quite aware of that were there and ready to support mum. So it helped me to they were able to identify do's and don'ts and were really open. So that sort of helped us have an idea of how to do some creative work with mum to get to where we needed to be to look at restoration. So we could see that she really did need a lot of support with parenting capacity. So we're able to work with our Aboriginal consultant to look at an intensive restoration program, an Aboriginal program in the area. Typically, this program offered group support. That was the way in. We worked with the program about we needed to start one-on-one, that was going to be more appropriate for mum to get her to feel more comfortable. And in having our consultant had actually offered to be there because they'd also developed a really good rapport. And our consultant was able to be there through the initial stages. And mum's now at the point where she's transitioned into the group and she's been attending, her attendance is outstanding. So yeah, I suppose there are some of the changes that we've made.
Fantastic, Cassie. It sounds great, and that way of meeting and being at the place where mum is, rather than trying to pull her where you want her to be, basically, and really partnering with her through that. And have you got any further examples of how you've worked with Aboriginal family that has benefited the restoration process overall?
Yeah, so I'm currently working with another young Aboriginal mum. She's a single parent of a little boy. We did some Aboriginal consultation again at the beginning of our engagement because we were really worried that a lot of the supports that DCJ were aware of, they'd had their own involvement with DCJ with their kids. So we were just a little bit concerned around, who are safe people in the network? So our Aboriginal consultant helped us do some family finding and was able to connect us to mum's grandma, who was actually a carer with an Aboriginal agency we weren't aware of at our team. So we went back to mum and asked, hey, is it okay for us to reach out to grandma? Is that someone that would you be comfortable for us to talk to? So mum had agreed to that. In speaking to grandma, we were able to find out that there were so many other family and community members who had been coming forward to grandma and saying, how can we support mum? We just didn't know that these people were there. And so without that consulting with our Aboriginal consultant, we wouldn't have known and had that opportunity to look at that family finding. So our consultant helped us organise a yarning circle with the family to come together and talk about what DCJ's worries and what are those next steps going to be so we can look towards restoration. So we really spoke openly about mum's mental health. We were really worried about and her need for some extra parenting support. So by the end of the discussion, the family actually came up with their own plan and were able to, the family actually had connections with some services that they previously used. So they linked mum in with an Aboriginal psychologist. They ran with that and helped link her in, helped her get her plans and everything to access that. And they'd identified as a family an intensive PRES service, an Aboriginal service that they were really comfortable with. So DCJ helped support with that referral. I guess throughout, I'm just mindful of time as well, but our role really became checking in with mum. The family were absolutely running with things, and it was really great because we had so many people we could check in with on mum's progress. We did a follow-up yarning circle with everyone to talk about mum's progress after several months. She'd been engaging really, really well. It got to the point where family were supervising family time with mum. DCJ, we didn't have contact workers or anything involved. And we've actually been able to restore a little boy to mum's care. It's actually only a couple of weeks ago. And there's an intensive service still involved. Mum had developed a really great rapport with her worker. And yeah, it was really great that we could see through a service involvement, but importance of the family and the community that are around mum, so this little boy could not only go home, but to stay home as well.
Oh, so refreshing to hear that, Cassie. And you know what it does for me is actually make me feel quite hopeful, much the same as what Jody had shared on the back of some of those alarming kind of statistics and details that have come through from BJ's research, and really allowing us to take stock, to take responsibility and ownership on past practice, but also look at what it could look like in the future to know that things could be done in significant partnership with families, but also the opportunity that it creates for us to be able to give power and autonomy back to families and have them involved in the decision making, but also the ability to be curious about who else is around. Cassie, you're talking about a matter where there were a family that we just didn't even know were there, but what they created in terms of that sense of safety and the network that was there to actually support Mum through that process just gave her so much strength and ability to lean into that space with us as well. I too am incredibly mindful of time. I know there may be some questions or some thoughts, or people may wish to want to put in the chat. Please do. We will have some staff available to sift through and provide any comment that is required. If there's questions that are specific to Jody, Cassie, or Alana, they will take on the responsibility to come in and give any sort of answers to you there. Can I thank the panel? Can we all thank the panel for their contribution to the conversations today, and what beautiful insights they've been able to provide to give some influence over some of the work that you may be doing out in the practice with leadership from those who are committed to this process, but also looking at innovative ways to do things differently, but also give power and autonomy and care back to our communities, Aboriginal families and children as well. For everyone that had registered for the event, next week you will receive an email with a link for the recording of this webinar. If anything that I could actually provide to you in terms of advice, it would be to utilise it in a group supervision session to really unpack and understand the insights from BJ's research, but also the advice and support that has been provided from some other practitioners who have been here with us today to share in their thoughts and their ideas, and also provide some reflections on that research as well. I feel honoured and privileged to be here to actually have been able to host it. I thank all of those who were in the background in terms of the partnership with FACSIA events and Teo and everyone who made this possible. And BJ, I can't wait to hear what is next with the current topical research that I'm really looking forward to hearing and learning more from you to give some greater influence over what practice can look like in the future for our mob, our people, our communities, and those that actually need it, so we can actually see children stay home but also return home as they deserve and expect and should. Yindamara, everyone. Thank you.